Ensign Kesh Doran had been assigned to the scout cruiser Ashen Vigil for less than 4 months when General Brennothi ordered the approach to the human research installation his own intelligence officers had designated, with the particular administrative flatness that made catastrophe sound survivable on paper, Contact Point 7. And in the years that followed, across a career that would carry him considerably further than he ever expected on the night everything changed. Doran would come to understand that survival itself was the least useful word available to describe what happened to the 51 souls who lived through what the rest of the Kelvax Dominion's military archives eventually filed, with the same careful, understated language as the Contact Point 7 incident. The Ashen Vigil was, at the time of that fateful approach, operating as the lead scout element of General Brennothi's larger invasion fleet, a force of 63 vessels that had spent the preceding 11 months pushing steadily through the outer border systems of human-held territory, in what Dominion strategic planners had confidently projected at the campaign's opening months, would prove a swift and largely uncontested advance toward the considerably more valuable core worlds that lay beyond the sparse, thinly defended frontier colonies the campaign's initial phase had targeted. Brennothi himself had earned command of that invasion fleet on the strength of 11 prior campaigns conducted across 3 separate decades of Dominion expansion, a career distinguished by exactly the kind of patient, methodical confidence that had made him, by the time the human campaign began, one of the Dominion's most consistently successful field commanders, a reputation built on a very specific, very consistent doctrine that his own officers had learned to trust without question across years of watching. It repeatedly validated against species less prepared, less coordinated, and considerably more willing to fold under the mere threat of Dominion force than their eventual human adversaries would prove to be. That doctrine, in its simplest formulation, held that most warnings issued by underprepared species represented calculated deterrence rather than genuine capability, a bluff constructed to buy time or extract better terms from an invading force the warning's issuer understood correctly, that it could not actually defeat through direct confrontation. Brennothi had tested that doctrine against 40 separate warnings across his 11 prior campaigns, and in 37 of those 40 cases, calling the bluff had proven not merely safe but tactically advantageous, exposing defensive gaps that a more cautious commander would have allowed the warning's issuer to simply talk their way around. The 3 cases in which the warning had proven genuine had cost the Dominion modest, manageable losses, casualties Brennothi's own after-action reports had characterized, in each instance, as an acceptable cost of maintaining the aggressive tempo that had made his campaigns so consistently successful across the whole of his long career. It was this same doctrine, tested and validated across 11 years and 40 prior warnings, that Brennothi carried into the modest, unremarkable debris field his own long-range survey had flagged as an abandoned human mining operation. And it was this same doctrine that would, within the following hour, collide catastrophically with the one warning among the 41 his career would eventually encounter that had never once contained even the smallest element of deception. The warning had arrived on every frequency the Ashen Vigil sensor array could register, transmitting in a steady, unhurried loop that had continued, according to the ship's own logs, for at least the preceding 6 years, broadcasting from a modest, unmanned relay beacon positioned at the outer edge of a debris field that Kelvax's long-range survey had originally flagged as an abandoned human mining operation, the kind of unremarkable, low-value target that advanced scout elements routinely investigated ahead of the Dominion's broader invasion timeline, without expecting to find anything worth reporting. This installation is protected by an automated lethal defense system. The beacon repeated, in the flat, mechanically translated cadence that Doran would hear in his own memory for the rest of his life, long after every other detail of that day had begun, mercifully, to blur. Unauthorized approach within the marked perimeter will result in immediate and total engagement. This is not a deterrent measure. This is not a bluff. Any vessel crossing the marked boundary will be destroyed without further warning. "Run the analysis again," Brennothi said, standing at the command station of the Ashen Vigil with the particular, unhurried confidence that Doran, in his brief 4 months of service, had already come to associate with the General's entire command phi. Philosophy, a confidence built, he would understand only much later, on 11 prior campaigns across a decade of Dominion expansion in which every warning issued by every underprepared species they'd encountered had proven, without exception, to be exactly the kind of empty deterrent the human beacon claimed, with such precise, unwavering specificity, not to be. The intelligence officer, a careful, methodical woman named Commander Vesa Thren, who had served under Brennothi for 6 years and had, by every account Doran would later gather, never once been wrong about a tactical assessment significant enough to matter, delivered her findings with the particular caution of someone who understood, better than anyone else aboard the ship, exactly how thin the ice beneath her conclusions actually was. The beacon's broadcast pattern is consistent with genuine automated defense infrastructure. General, she said. Not merely consistent with it. I would go further and say it is difficult to construct an alternative explanation for a transmission this specific, this consistently maintained, across 6 years of continuous operation, if its underlying purpose were purely deceptive. Deceptive warnings, in my experience across this campaign and the 3 before it, tend toward exaggeration, toward broad, unspecific threats designed to provoke maximum uncertainty in the receiving party. This beacon does the opposite. It specifies exactly what will happen, exactly when it will happen, and offers no embellishment beyond the precise, procedural fact of the consequence itself. I would recommend, General, that we treat this warning as genuine until we possess evidence considerably stronger than our prior campaign experience to suggest otherwise. Brennothi considered her assessment for a long moment, his attention moving between the tactical display, where the modest debris field surrounding the beacon showed no visible structures beyond a scattering of what his own sensor officers had already classified as inert mining equipment, and the beacon's continuing transmission, still looping through its same unwavering warning with a patience that Doran, watching the exchange from his own junior station near the rear of the bridge, found himself finding considerably more unsettling than he could have explained to anyone who asked him to justify the feeling. "Commander Thren," Brennothi said finally, "I have commanded this fleet through 11 campaigns, and in 11 campaigns, I have encountered perhaps 40 warnings of comparable specificity, issued by species considerably more sophisticated than whatever remnant human presence built this modest mining relay. Every one of those 40 warnings, without exception, described a defensive capability that either did not exist at all, or existed in a form so degraded by the time we tested it that the difference between bluff and genuine threat proved, in practice, to be entirely academic. I understand your caution, and I respect the rigor of your analysis. But I would ask you to consider the alternative calculation, which is this. If we withdraw from every well-constructed warning we encounter across this campaign, on the theoretical possibility that this particular one, unlike the 40 before it, happens to be genuine, we will conquer nothing, because every underprepared species eventually learns, from observing our prior campaigns, exactly how to construct a warning specific enough to sound credible. The specificity you find so persuasive, Commander, is precisely the feature I would expect from an adversary who has studied our own doctrine closely enough to understand what kind of warning we're most likely to respect. General, Thren said, her voice carrying for the first time in the exchange, something that Doran recognized, even in his junior inexperience, as genuine alarm rather than professional caution. I would ask you to consider one additional data point before we proceed. This beacon has been transmitting continuously for at least 6 years, according to our own long-range archive. A deceptive warning constructed to bluff advanced scouts typically activates only when a scanning vessel enters detection range, precisely because maintaining a continuous broadcast across years of operation, with no guarantee any scout will ever pass close enough to receive it, represents a considerable and largely pointless expenditure of resources for a species we have already assessed as resource-constrained by this stage of the war. Why would an underprepared, resource-limited human outpost maintain a 6-year continuous broadcast warning, at real cost to its own power budget, unless the warning itself protected something the humans considered worth that continuous expenditure? Brennothi was quiet for a moment, and Doran, watching from his station, allowed himself the brief, foolish hope that Thren's final argument had finally landed with the weight it deserved. It had not, or rather it had landed, and had simply not been enough to overcome 11 years of accumulated certainty built across a decade of campaigns in which caution, more often than not, had cost the Dominion tactical opportunities that bolder commanders exploited without consequence. Proceed with the approach, Brennothi said. Modest caution, Commander, hold the Ashen Vigil at the outer edge of the marked perimeter, and send the boarding shuttle in alone to assess the facility directly before committing the full ship. If your analysis proves correct, we lose a single shuttle and its crew, a cost I am prepared to accept in exchange for the certainty of knowing whether this installation represents genuine value, or, as I continue to believe more likely, an elaborate and ultimately empty deterrent. Doran had been scheduled, in the original boarding roster drafted the previous evening, to serve as a member of that shuttle's 6-person crew, a modest assignment reflecting nothing more than the unremarkable rotation schedule that governed junior officer duties aboard the Ashen Vigil. A last-minute reassignment to cover an unrelated sensor station shortage on the bridge, issued barely an hour before departure by an administrative officer who never learned, in all the years that followed, exactly what that routine reshuffling had spared him from, pulled Doran from the roster and replaced him with another ensign whose name Doran would carry alongside Solandry's for the remainder of his life. He would spend the remainder of his long life understanding that single administrative accident of scheduling as the dividing line between the officer he might otherwise have become and the one he actually did. He remembered, with a clarity that never once dimmed across the following decades, the specific quality of the 20 minutes the 6-member shuttle crew spent in final preparation before departure, gathered in the Ashen Vigil's modest launch bay while Lieutenant Vex Solandry conducted the routine equipment check that preceded every boarding operation the ship had ever conducted. Solandry was, by Doran's own brief 4 months of observation, an unremarkable officer in most respects, competent without being especially distinguished. The kind of steady, dependable lieutenant that larger commands relied upon precisely, because he rarely drew attention to himself in either direction. But Doran remembered, too, the particular stillness in Solandry's manner that morning, a stillness he had not yet, in his own limited experience, learned to recognize as the specific quality of a man carrying doubts he did not feel positioned to voice. "You've reviewed the beacon transcript," Solandry said to him quietly, as the two of them completed a final systems check on the shuttle's modest defensive countermeasures, equipment that would, within the hour, prove entirely inadequate to the task the mission required of it. The full transcript, not just the summary Commander Thren circulated to the boarding team. "I have, Lieutenant." "And what do you make of it, Ensign, in your own honest assessment? Not the one you'd give if a superior officer asked you the same question in a formal debrief." Doran had considered the question carefully before answering, understanding, even in his junior inexperience, that Solandry was asking for something genuine rather than the reflexive confidence junior officers typically offered their commanding officers before a mission. "I believe Commander Thren's analysis, Lieutenant," he said finally. "I do not fully understand why the General reached a different conclusion, given how carefully she constructed her argument." Solandry had been quiet for a long moment, his attention on the shuttle's modest hull, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something Doran would spend years afterward trying, and largely failing, to adequately describe to anyone who asked him about that final conversation. "I believe her too," he said. "I have believed her since she first presented her analysis to the General, and I have said nothing beyond the ordinary channels available to an officer of my rank, because I do not believe this fleet's command structure genuinely welcomes a lieutenant's doubts once a general has already rendered his decision. I want you to understand something, Ensign, in case this morning goes the way I privately suspect it might. I am not proceeding into that perimeter because I believe the beacon is bluffing. I am proceeding because I have spent 9 years learning that a Dominion officer's doubts, however well-founded, rarely survive contact with a superior's settled confidence, and I have not yet found the particular courage required to be the officer who breaks that pattern, whatever it might eventually cost me to maintain it." Doran carried those words with him for the remainder of his career, understanding them, across the many years of subsequent reflection that followed, as the truest and most painful lesson Contact Point 7 ever taught him, not simply that Brennothi had been wrong to dismiss Thren's warning, but that an entire institutional culture had made it nearly impossible for officers who shared her doubts to voice them with anything approaching the weight those doubts deserved, until the cost of that silence arrived, all at once. In the 4 catastrophic seconds it took the Sentinel array to confirm exactly what the beacon had spent 6 years patiently promising. The shuttle crossed the beacon's marked perimeter at 8:47 ship time, carrying 6 crew members under the command of a modest, unremarkable lieutenant named Vex Solandry, who had, by every account Doran would later reconstruct, harbored his own private doubts about the mission that he had not felt positioned enough within the Dominion's rigid command hierarchy to voice aloud. The automated defense system activated within 4 seconds of the shuttle crossing the marked boundary, a response so immediate and so completely disproportionate to the shuttle's modest, unarmed profile that Doran, watching from the Ashen Vigil's own sensor display, would later struggle to describe the specific sequence of events to anyone who asked, because the sequence itself had unfolded with a speed that left almost nothing for conscious memory to properly register beyond the sudden, absolute cessation of the shuttle's transponder signal. What survived, in the formal record the Dominion's own investigators would eventually compile from the Ashen Vigil's sensor logs, was considerably more precise than Doran's own memory of the moment, and considerably more damning of the assumption that had sent Solandri's crew into the perimeter in the first place. The defense system, identified in the subsequent investigation as an automated kinetic and directed energy array, integrated directly into the debris field's scattered mining equipment, itself a deliberate camouflage the human engineers had designed specifically to disguise a genuine weapons platform as harmless industrial debris, engaged the shuttle with a precision and completeness that left no ambiguity whatsoever about the beacon's original claim. The shuttle was not disabled. It was not captured. It was destroyed, completely, within the 4 seconds the beacon had promised, exactly as specified, with no deviation whatsoever from the terms it had broadcast continuously for 6 uninterrupted years, to an audience that had, until that morning, never once arrived to test them. "Report," Brennothi said, his voice carrying, for the first time since Doran's assignment to his command, something that might genuinely have been called shock, though the general's own considerable discipline compressed it, almost immediately, back into the flat, procedural register his crew had come to expect from him. "Shuttle destroyed, General," Thren said, her own voice carrying none of the vindicated satisfaction Doran might have expected from an officer whose warning had just been so completely, catastrophically confirmed. All 6 crew members confirmed lost. The defense system's engagement profile matches, in every measurable respect, exactly what the beacon specified. I would recommend immediate withdrawal beyond the marked perimeter, General, and I would recommend it with the full weight of everything this engagement has just demonstrated about the accuracy of the warning we chose not to fully credit. Brennothi gave the order to withdraw, and the Ashen Vigil pulled back from the debris field with a speed that Doran, watching the tactical display from his own station, understood, even in the raw shock of the preceding minutes, as its own quiet acknowledgement of exactly how badly the general's calculation had failed. But the withdrawal, when it finally came, arrived too late to spare the ship entirely, because the automated defense system's engagement envelope, as Thren's follow-up analysis would eventually determine, extended considerably beyond the marked perimeter itself, into a secondary detection radius that the beacon's own broadcast had never explicitly specified, a gap in the warning's precision that Doran would spend years afterward understanding not as evidence of human deception, but as the simple, brutal consequence of a defense system calibrated for a threat considerably larger than the single unarmed shuttle that had first tested it. The Ashen Vigil took 3 direct strikes from the defense array's secondary engagement radius before it cleared the extended perimeter entirely. Strikes that killed 41 additional crew members across the ship's forward and midship sections, including Commander Vesa Thren herself, killed at her own station in the final seconds before the ship's shields finally regenerated enough capacity to withstand the array's diminishing effective range. The Ashen Vigil took 3 direct strikes from the defense array's secondary engagement radius before it cleared the extended perimeter entirely. Strikes that killed 41 additional crew members across the ship's forward and midship sections, including Commander Vesa Thren herself, killed at her own station in the final seconds before the ship's shields finally regenerated enough capacity to withstand the array's diminishing effective range. Doran remembered the sequence of those 3 strikes with a fragmented, disordered clarity that never fully resolved into a coherent narrative, no matter how many times he attempted, across the following years, to reconstruct it for the various formal inquiries that eventually required his testimony. The first strike had taken the forward sensor array, plunging the bridge into a chaos of failing displays and shouted damage reports that Doran, at his own modest station near the rear of the bridge, could barely follow above the ship's own emergency alarms. The second strike, arriving perhaps 11 seconds later according to the ship's own logs, though it had felt to Doran like both an instant and an eternity compressed into the same impossible span of time, had taken the midship crew quarters and the adjacent secondary command station, where Commander Thren had remained at her post, continuing to call out withdrawal vectors to the helm even as the ship's structural integrity alarms climbed toward their most severe classification. The third strike, the one that finally caught the edge of Doran's own station, had arrived as the ship crossed the very outer boundary of the array's extended range, close enough to full clearance that the blast's diminished intensity was, according to the subsequent technical assessment, the only reason Doran survived it at all. He remembered in the disordered seconds that followed the specific weight of the collapsed support strut that had pinned his left leg to the deck, the particular quality of the silence that settled over the ruined section of bridge once the ship's alarms finally cycled down from their peak intensity, and the sight, which he would carry with him for the remainder of his life with a clarity nothing else from that morning ever quite matched, of Commander Thren's own station, dark and silent. In the wreckage of the secondary command position, where she had spent her final 11 seconds trying to save a ship that had refused, in the critical moment that mattered most, to credit the analysis that would have prevented the tragedy entirely. Doran survived, thrown clear of his own station's collapsing support structure by a blast that killed the 2 officers stationed on either side of him, and he would carry, for the remainder of his career, a scar along the left side of his jaw that never fully faded, a physical reminder, he would tell colleagues in later years, of the exact moment he understood, with a clarity no subsequent briefing or tribunal record could ever fully replicate. Precisely what it cost to disbelieve a warning that had never once claimed to be anything other than completely, literally true. The Ashen Vigil limped back to the main Dominion invasion fleet 3 days later, carrying 47 dead and 4 critically wounded among its original crew complement of 92. And General Brennothi's formal report to the Dominion's War Council, submitted within hours of the ship's return, would become, in the years that followed, one of the most extensively studied documents in the entire archive of the Dominion's costly, ultimately unsuccessful campaign against human territory. "I want the Council to understand," Brennothi wrote, in language that Doran, reading the report years later in his own capacity as a senior officer with formal access to the archive, found himself returning to many times across the remainder of his career, that this engagement did not result from any failure of intelligence gathering, nor from any deficiency in the Ashen Vigil's own defensive preparation. It resulted, entirely and without mitigating circumstance, from my own decision to weight 11 years of prior campaign experience more heavily than the specific, unambiguous evidence presented to me by my own intelligence officer in the moments before the engagement began. Commander Thren argued, correctly and with considerable rigor, that this particular warning differed in kind from every prior deterrent we had previously tested, and I dismissed her analysis on the grounds that specificity itself could be manufactured by a sufficiently sophisticated adversary. I was wrong, and I do not believe there is any tactical lesson from this engagement worth preserving beyond the plain, humbling fact that I mistook consistency and precision for evidence of deception, when in fact they should have been read as exactly what they were. The signature of a species that does not construct warnings to deceive, but constructs them with considerable engineering investment and considerable patience, specifically because it intends every warning it issues to be believed and honored precisely, as stated. The War Council's response to that report occupied the better part of 2 months of formal review, conducted alongside a broader, increasingly urgent reassessment of the Dominion's entire approach to human territory that the Contact Point 7 incident had, in its own small but consequential way, helped precipitate. Doran, promoted to full lieutenant in the reorganization that followed the Ashen Vigil's return to active service, found himself called before that review on 3 separate occasions, testimony that he delivered with a careful, deliberate honesty he had not fully expected of himself, given how thoroughly the engagement's memory continued to disrupt his sleep across the months of formal proceedings that followed. "I want to understand something, Lieutenant Doran," said Counselor Mersh Vothan, the War Council's senior representative overseeing the review during Doran's second appearance before the formal proceedings, "that I do not believe the written record fully captures. You were aboard the boarding shuttle's parent vessel, close enough to witness the engagement directly. I would like your own account, in your own words, of what that moment taught you, beyond what General Brennothi's own report has already documented." Doran considered the question for a long moment before he answered, understanding, even as he formed his response, that whatever he said in this chamber would follow him for the remainder of his career, in ways he could not yet fully anticipate. "Counselor," he said finally, "I have spent the month since that engagement trying to understand exactly what I believe it taught me, and I do not believe I have arrived at a complete answer even now. But I can tell you what I understood in the specific, disorienting seconds after the shuttle's transponder went dark, watching Commander Thren's own face as she confirmed what her analysis had already told her would happen. I understood that we had spent 11 years learning the wrong lesson from every warning we successfully called a bluff, because every successful bluff calling taught us that warnings, as a category, were unreliable, when in fact what we should have learned across those same 11 years was that different species construct warnings for entirely different reasons, and that the humans, whatever else may be true of them, appear to construct theirs specifically so that they will never once need to be tested twice." Counselor Vothan pressed further, leaning forward slightly in a manner that Doran understood, even in his junior position before the full formality of the Council's proceedings, as genuine rather than merely procedural interest. "You mentioned, in your written statement, a conversation you had with Lieutenant Solandry before the shuttle's departure. I would like to understand, Lieutenant Doran, whether you believe that conversation represents an isolated instance of one officer's private doubt, or whether you believe it reflects something more systemic within this fleet's command culture." "I believe it reflects something systemic, Counselor," Doran said, and he felt, even as he spoke the words, the particular weight of an answer he understood might carry consequences for officers considerably senior to his own modest rank. "Lieutenant Solandry told me in the minutes before his death that he had believed Commander Thren's analysis from the moment she first presented it, and that he had said nothing through any formal channel, because he did not believe this fleet's command structure genuinely welcomed a junior officer's doubts, once a general had already rendered his decision. I do not believe Lieutenant Solandry was unusual in holding that belief, Counselor. I believe, based on conversations I have had with surviving crew members in the months since the engagement, that a considerable number of officers aboard the Ashen Vigil shared some version of his doubt, and that a considerable number of them said nothing, for precisely the same reason he gave me. I would ask this council to consider, in whatever reforms eventually emerge from this review, whether the failure at contact point 7 was truly a single officer's misjudgment, or whether it was the predictable, eventual result of a command culture that had spent 11 years teaching its officers that voicing doubt against a settled decision carried more professional risk than simply proceeding in silence and hoping the doubt proved unfounded. The chamber was quiet for a long moment following that answer, and Doran understood, watching the careful, considering expressions of the council members seated before him, that his testimony had shifted something in the proceedings' broader direction, from a narrow inquiry into a single commander's tactical error toward a considerably more uncomfortable examination of the institutional culture that had made his error not merely possible, but, in retrospect, almost predictable. Not every member of the coup. Ensil received that shift with the same openness Vothan had shown. Councillor Dresh Kalarn, a considerably more senior member of the body whose own career predated the human campaign by several decades, pressed Doran with a line of questioning that carried, beneath its formal courtesy, a clear skepticism toward the broader institutional critique his testimony had begun to suggest. "Lieutenant Doran," Kalarn said, "I want to be direct with you about a concern this line of testimony raises for me. You are, by your own account, a junior officer with less than a year of active service at the time of the engagement in question. You are now suggesting, before this council, that an entire command culture built across decades of successful Dominion military doctrine bears responsibility for a single commander's tactical error. I would ask you to consider whether that suggestion reflects genuine institutional insight, or whether it reflects, understandably enough given the trauma you personally experienced, a need to locate the failure somewhere larger than a single officer's judgment, so that the loss feels less arbitrary, less simply the product of one man's mistaken confidence." Doran had felt the weight of that question settle over him with a particular, uncomfortable precision, understanding that Kalarn's skepticism, however unwelcome, was not without its own legitimate basis. He had considered his answer carefully before offering it, understanding that whatever he said next would either strengthen or undermine everything his testimony had built across the preceding hour. "Counselor," he said finally, "I understand why you would ask that question, and I want to answer it as honestly as I am able. I cannot fully separate my own grief from my own analysis, and I do not believe any officer testifying about the deaths of colleagues they served alongside could honestly claim otherwise. But I would ask this council to consider the specific pattern of evidence beyond my own testimony alone. General Brennothi's own written report, submitted before I ever appeared before this council, reaches substantially the same conclusion I have reached independently, that his decision reflected a habit of mind built across 11 years of prior campaigning, rather than a single isolated misjudgment. Commander Thren's own final analysis, preserved in the ship's logs, explicitly anticipated that her warning would likely be dismissed for reasons rooted in exactly this pattern, which suggests she herself understood, better than any of us testifying after the fact, precisely how institutionalized the underlying assumption had become. I do not ask this council to accept my testimony because I am uniquely positioned to offer unbiased analysis, counselor. I ask this council to weigh my testimony alongside General Brennothi's own report and Commander Thren's own preserved reasoning, and to consider whether the convergence of all three, from three very different positions within this fleet's hierarchy, suggests something more than a single grieving officer's need for a larger explanation. Kalarn had been quiet for a long moment following that answer, and though the formal record would never indicate whether Doran's response had genuinely shifted the senior counselor's position, the reforms that eventually emerged from the council's deliberations passed with a majority considerably larger than the narrow margin some observers had initially predicted, suggested that the convergence of evidence Doran had described carried weight beyond what any single officer's testimony, however carefully reasoned, could have achieved alone. The reforms that eventually emerged from the War Council's extended review were, by the standards of the Dominion's own historically slow, deliberative institutional culture, remarkably swift and remarkably comprehensive, driven in no small part by the simple, uncomfortable fact that Contact Point 7 represented only the first, and by no means the most costly, engagement in which Dominion forces would eventually learn. At considerable and repeated expense across the following 2 years of continued campaigning, exactly how consistently human warnings meant precisely what they claimed to mean. A formal intelligence directive, issued within 4 months of Brennothi's original report, required every Dominion scout element to treat any warning specifying immediate, unambiguous consequence as presumptively genuine, unless considerable positive evidence indicated deception, a reversal of the Dominion's prior default assumption that Doran would come to understand. Across the years, he spent helping implement the directive within his own subsequent commands. As the single most consequential doctrinal shift of the entire war, Brennothi himself was not court-martialed, a decision that surprised Doran considerably at the time and that he came to understand only years later, once his own career had advanced far enough to grant HFY access to the full deliberations behind the War Council's ultimate judgment, as a considered, deliberate choice, rather than any failure of institutional accountability. The Council's formal ruling, delivered some 5 months after the original engagement, found Brennothi's decision to proceed against Thren's explicit recommendation to be a serious and consequential error of judgment, but declined to pursue formal disciplinary action beyond a permanent notation in his service record, on the grounds, articulated at length in the ruling's closing section, that removing Brennothi from service entirely would deprive the Dominion of precisely the kind of hard-won, personally costly wisdom his own subsequent conduct had already begun to demonstrate. General Brennothi's report to this council, the ruling read, in language Doran would eventually commit to memory across the many years he spent citing it in his own training of junior officers, represents one of the most complete and unflinching accountings of command failure this council has received in the considerable history of its deliberations. We do not believe an officer capable of that particular, difficult honesty should be discarded simply because the lesson that produced it arrived at unacceptable cost. We believe instead that General Brennothi's remaining service to this Dominion should be conducted under the specific, permanent condition that every subsequent command decision he makes be measured against the standard Commander Thren attempted, and failed, to establish in the moments before her death. The standard of treating a specific, unambiguous warning as a statement of genuine intent rather than a negotiable opening position, until overwhelming evidence proves otherwise. "I want to ask you something, General," Doran said, some 18 months after the Contact Point 7 incident, during a quiet watch shift aboard Brennothi's new command vessel, The two of them alone on the bridge in the particular, unhurried stillness of a deep space transit period with no immediate engagement scheduled. I have served under your command for nearly 2 years now, since the incident, and I have watched you apply Commander Thren's standard with a consistency I do not believe any external review could have compelled from you if you had not genuinely internalized the lesson yourself. I would like to understand, honestly, what changed in you, beyond the formal reprimand and the council's ruling. Brennothi was quiet for a long moment, his attention on the slow drift of stars beyond the viewport, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight Doran had not heard from him even in the immediate, raw aftermath of the original engagement. "I think about Commander Thren often, Lieutenant," he said. "I think about the specific, careful rigor of her final argument, the observation about the beacon's 6-year continuous broadcast that I dismissed too quickly to properly weigh. I have come to believe, across the months since her death, that the failure was never really about tactical judgment in the narrow sense. It was about a deeper, more troubling habit of mind that 11 years of successful campaigning had allowed me to develop without ever once being forced to examine it honestly. I had learned, across those 11 years, to treat every warning as a puzzle to be solved through pattern matching against prior experience, rather than as a genuine communication from another mind, offered in good faith, that deserved to be evaluated on its own specific terms rather than folded automatically into a category built from encounters with entirely different species, in entirely different circumstances. I do not know that I would have arrived at that understanding without the cost contact point 7 extracted to teach it to me. I wish, more than I can adequately express to you, that the lesson had arrived by some less expensive means. But I do not believe I am capable of unlearning it now, whatever it originally cost to learn. Brennothi carried that standard into every subsequent campaign he commanded across the remaining 3 years of the war, a transformation that Doran, serving under his continued command through 2 further engagements before his own eventual transfer to an independent posting, observed with a complicated mixture of professional respect and unresolved personal grief that he never fully reconciled, even decades later. When he had risen to a position of considerable seniority within the Dominion's post-war military establishment. The test of that transformation arrived some 14 months after contact point 7, during an engagement that Doran would come to regard, across the whole of his subsequent career, as the clearest possible demonstration of exactly how completely Brennothi's own hard-won lesson had reshaped his command instincts. The fleet had encountered a second human installation, considerably larger and more strategically signy. Ficant than the modest research station that had cost the Ashen Vigil so dearly, defended by its own warning beacon broadcasting a similarly specific, unambiguous threat of automated engagement. "General," said the fleet's new intelligence officer, a careful young commander named Ussa Kellen who had transferred into the position following Thren's death, and who had, by every account, studied her predecessor's final analysis with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. "The beacon's specification pattern is nearly identical to the one Commander Thren identified at contact point 7. Continuous 6-year broadcast, precise engagement parameters, no embellishment beyond the procedural fact of the consequence itself. I would recommend treating this warning as genuine." Brennothi had not hesitated, in a manner that Doran, watching from his own considerably more senior station by that point in the campaign, understood as the direct, measurable product of everything the general had spent the preceding 14 months forcing himself to internalize. "Full withdrawal to standard engagement range," he said. "Commander Kellen, I want a complete technical analysis of every disclosed parameter in that beacon's broadcast, including any secondary data channels, before this fleet takes any further action in this system. We will not repeat Contact Point 7's error, and we will not repeat it by rushing the analysis this time either, whatever pressure the broader campaign timeline places on this decision." The subsequent analysis, conducted over the following 3 days with a thoroughness that would have been unthinkable under the fleet's prior operational tempo, confirmed the installation's defenses to be exactly as genuine and exactly as lethal as the beacon claimed, and Brennothi's decision to withdraw entirely, rerouting the fleet's advance around the installation rather than risking any further contact, cost the campaign's broader timeline nearly 2 weeks of delay that his own superiors. Still operating under the Dominion's older, more aggressive doctrine, initially questioned with some considerable skepticism. "You are proposing we simply avoid a target rather than test its actual capability," said one such superior, a considerably more senior fleet admiral named Korash Vale, during a formal review of Brennothi's decision conducted some weeks later. "I understand the lesson Contact Point 7 taught you, General, and I do not dispute its validity in the abstract. But I would ask whether an entire campaign's tempo should be permanently altered by a single, admittedly costly incident, or whether there exists some more measured approach that preserves this fleet's operational effectiveness, while still incorporating the caution that incident clearly demonstrated was warranted." "Admiral," Brennothi said, and Doran, present at that review in his own capacity as a senior aide, understood, watching the exchange, that he was witnessing the general articulate a conviction that had by that point become entirely, permanently his own rather than simply a standard imposed on him by external council ruling. "I lost 47 officers and crew learning that a precisely constructed warning issued by this particular adversary means exactly what it says. I do not believe that lesson expires after a single application, however inconvenient its continued observance proves to this campaign's broader timeline. I would ask you to consider the alternative calculation, which is this: every additional engagement in which we correctly credit a genuine human warning costs us, at most, the tactical opportunity that warning was protecting. Every engagement in which we incorrectly dismiss one costs us, as Contact Point 7 demonstrated with considerable precision, an entire ship's crew complement, and I do not believe any campaign timeline consideration justifies accepting that risk repeatedly, once its actual cost has been so completely, personally demonstrated to the officer responsible for weighing it. That subsequent engagement, and the several similar decisions Brennothi made across the remaining years of the war, would eventually be cited, in the Dominion's own post-war military histories, as among the clearest examples of exactly the kind of doctrinal reform that Contact Point 7's costly lesson had ultimately produced across the broader institution. A reform that Doran, in his own later career building the Dominion's reformed intelligence training academy, would come to understand as Brennothi's own quiet, largely unpublicized penance for a decision he never once, in all the years that followed, attempted to minimize or explain away. Doran carried that conversation with him through the remainder of the war, and through the considerably longer peace that eventually followed it, a peace negotiated across 3 difficult years of formal proceedings between the Kelvac's Dominion and a coalition of human governments whose own military doctrine had, by the war's final year, made clear beyond any reasonable dispute exactly how costly The Dominion's slow institutional learning curve had proven across every engagement that followed Contact Point 7's original catastrophic lesson. Doran carried that conversation with him through the remainder of the war, and through the considerably longer peace that eventually followed it. A peace negotiated across 3 difficult years of formal proceedings between the Kelvax Dominion and a coalition of human governments whose own military doctrine had, by the war's final year, made clear beyond any reasonable dispute exactly how costly the Dominion's slow institutional learning curve had proven across every engagement that followed Contact Point 7's original catastrophic lesson. Before that peace, however, in the difficult months immediately following his recovery from the injuries he sustained aboard the Ashen Vigil, Doran had undertaken a considerably more private pilgrimage, traveling to Commander Thren's home world to meet with the family she had left behind. A visit he had not been required to make by any formal protocol, but had felt, in the raw aftermath of her death, unable to avoid making regardless. Thren's partner, a quiet, careful man named Oren Vesk, who had raised their 2 young children largely alone across the 6 years of his partner's continuous deployment, received Doran in the modest home the family had shared, and Doran found himself, in the difficult hour that followed, uncertain how to begin a conversation he had traveled considerable distance specifically to have. "I read the formal notification," Vesk said, before Doran had found the words to start himself. "It told me she died in the line of duty, defending her ship against hostile action. It did not tell me the specific circumstances beyond that bare fact. I have wondered in the months since whether I actually wanted to know more, or whether the formal notification's careful vagueness was, in its own way, a kindness I should simply have accepted without pressing further." Doran considered this for a long moment before he answered, understanding that whatever he chose to share in this conversation would become, for this family, the permanent shape of a loss that no amount of careful language could ever fully soften. "I believe you deserve to know the truth if you want it," he said. "I also believe you have every right to decline it, and I will respect whichever choice you make." Vesk was quiet for a long moment, his attention on the 2 children, playing in the modest garden visible through the home's rear window, apparently unaware of the conversation happening inside. "Tell me," he said finally. "Not the formal version, the true one." Doran told him, in full, the account he would eventually deliver to the War Council's formal review, the account of Thren's careful, rigorous analysis, of Brennothi's decision to proceed against it, of her final 11 seconds calling out withdrawal vectors from a station she never left even as the ship's alarms climbed toward their most severe classification. He told him, too, about the beacon's continuing broadcast, still transmitting its same unwavering warning long after the Ashen Vigil had withdrawn beyond its range. A warning that had proven, in every measurable respect, exactly as true as Thren had argued it would be. "She was right," Vesk said finally, and something in his voice carried a complicated mixture of grief and a fierce, protective pride that Doran understood, even in his own uncertain grasp of human emotional expression, as the particular shape love sometimes took when it could no longer be delivered to the person who had earned it. She spent 6 years arguing that careful, honest analysis mattered more than accumulated assumption, and she was right, in the end, about the one thing that mattered most in the final minutes of her life. "I want you to promise me something, Ensign, if you're willing to make a promise to someone you've only just met." "I'll try, if it's within my power to keep it." "Make sure she was right about more than just the beacon," Vesk said. "Make sure the lesson actually changes something, beyond a single formal notation in a service record that fades from institutional memory the moment the officers who remember it retire or die. I do not want my children to grow up believing their mother died, proving a point that the people responsible for hearing it simply filed away and forgot. Doran had carried that promise with him for the remainder of his career, understanding it, across the decades that followed, as the private, unofficial mandate underlying every public reform he eventually helped implement, every training course he eventually taught, every cadet he eventually stood before to explain exactly what Commander Vesa Thren's careful, rigorous analysis had cost, and exactly what it had ultimately, hard-earned, achieved. Ended the formal peace signing himself, by then risen to the rank of Commodore and serving as one of the Dominion's senior military liaisons to the negotiating delegation. And he found himself, in the quiet hours before the ceremony's formal proceedings began, seeking out a specific member of the human delegation whose name he had encountered some months earlier. In the course of his own private research into exactly what had built the automated defense system that killed Commander Thren and 46 other Ashen Vigil crew members on a morning that had never, in all the years since, fully released its grip on his memory. Dr. Farah Bishara had designed the Sentinel array that protected Prometheus Station, the research installation that Contact Point 7's debris field had disguised so completely. Across a career spent developing exactly the kind of automated deterrent infrastructure that had, by the war's conclusion, become standard protective doctrine across every significant human research and manufacturing facility operating near contested space. She had begun that career considerably earlier than the war itself, in the years before the Kelvax Dominion's presence in human-adjacent space had become a matter of confirmed strategic concern, working as a junior systems engineer on a modest team tasked with developing automated defenses for isolated research outposts operating beyond the range of conventional fleet protection. Her early work had followed the field's then-standard doctrine, favoring deterrent systems calibrated to disable rather than destroy, warnings deliberately vague enough to preserve tactical flexibility, and defense profiles designed to escalate gradually in response to increasingly aggressive intrusion. She had grown, across the several years she spent working within that doctrine, increasingly convinced that its underlying assumptions were fundamentally, dangerously mistaken, a conviction that crystallized fully during a specific incident early in her career that she rarely discussed publicly, but that Doran, in the course of his own private research into her background, eventually uncovered through the Dominion's post-war technical exchange archives. A modest human survey outpost, protected by exactly the kind of gradual escalation defense doctrine Bishara had been trained to build, had been tested by an unrelated hostile force during the years before the Kelvax War, a force that had correctly calculated, through careful observation of the outpost's initial, deliberately restrained response, that the defenses posed no genuine existential threat to a sufficiently persistent attacker. The outpost had eventually fallen, its modest research staff killed or captured, in an engagement that internal review would later attribute directly to the defense system's own carefully calibrated ambiguity. A system designed to avoid unnecessary escalation that had, in practice, simply taught its attacker exactly how much aggression the outpost's automated defenses could absorb before genuine consequence arrived. Bishara had left that project within months of the review's conclusion, carrying with her a conviction that would eventually shape every subsequent system she designed across the remainder of her career. That ambiguity, however well-intentioned, functioned as its own kind of invitation to precisely the aggression it was meant to discourage, and that the only genuinely effective deterrent was one that removed ambiguity entirely, replacing it with a warning so complete, so unwavering in its specificity, that no rational adversary could mistake it for anything other than exactly what it claimed to be. I built the Sentinel array around a single principle that I have never once abandoned, across every subsequent design I have produced, she would explain, years later. In the technical retrospective she contributed to the joint Dominion-Human Historical Archive established during the peace process. A warning's power lies entirely in its recipient's confidence that it means precisely what it says. Every element of ambiguity you introduce into a deterrent system, however reasonable it may seem in isolation, chips away at that confidence, and an adversary sophisticated enough to notice the ambiguity will eventually, inevitably, test it. I decided, after the loss of that early outpost, that I would rather build systems too honest to be misunderstood than systems clever enough to be exploited by anyone patient enough to study their edges. It was this same conviction, tested and refined across nearly a decade of subsequent design work, that had produced the Sentinel Array's beacon, broadcasting its unwavering warning for 6 continuous years to an audience that had, until the morning General Brennothi's fleet finally arrived to test it, never once needed to hear it. She had not attended the peace signing expecting to be sought out by a senior Dominion officer, and she studied Doran with the particular, careful attention of someone accustomed to being approached, in professional settings, by people with strong and not always friendly opinions about the systems she had spent her career building. "Commodore," she said, once the introductions had concluded and the two of them had found a quiet corner of the reception hall considerably removed from the ceremony's more formal proceedings. "I understand you served aboard the Ashen Vigil at Contact Point 7. I want to say, before this conversation proceeds any further, that I have thought about that engagement many times across the years since, and I do not believe there is any version of "I'm sorry" adequate to what your crew experienced there, whatever the underlying justification for the system's design. "I did not seek you out for an apology, Doctor," Doran said. "I sought you out because I have spent 18 years trying to understand something about the system you built, and I have never had the opportunity to ask its designer directly. The beacon specified a marked perimeter, and within that perimeter, the consequence it described arrived exactly as promised, to the second, exactly as specified. But the engagement extended considerably beyond that marked boundary, into a secondary radius the beacon never disclosed. I lost 41 additional crew members to that undisclosed extension, Doctor, including an officer I had served under for only 4 months, but who had argued, correctly and with considerable courage, against the decision that sent us into the perimeter at all. I would like to understand why that secondary radius existed, and why it was never included in the beacon's warning." Bishara was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice carried the particular, careful weight of someone choosing her words with considerable deliberate care. "The secondary radius existed because the Sentinel array was designed to protect against a considerably larger threat than a single unarmed shuttle, Commodore. It was calibrated to engage a full assault fleet if necessary, and full fleet engagements require an effective range extending well beyond any single vessel's immediate approach vector, to prevent supporting ships from simply hovering at the perimeter's edge and providing covering fire while a smaller element tested the boundary. I want to be honest with you about something that I do not believe will make this conversation easier," but that I believe you deserve to hear plainly rather than diplomatically softened. We did disclose the full engagement envelope, Commodore, in the technical specification appended to the beacon's continuous broadcast, transmitted on a secondary data channel alongside the primary voice warning. Your ship's own sensor logs, which I have reviewed as part of the post-war technical exchange between our governments, confirm that the Ashen Vigil received that secondary transmission in full. I do not believe your crew ignored it deliberately. I believe, based on everything I understand about how Dominion sensor analysis prioritized incoming data during that period of the war, that your intelligence officers simply did not have time to process a full technical specification in the brief minutes between the shuttle's destruction and your own ship's exposure to the array's extended range. That is not a failure of honesty on our part, Commodore. I want to be very clear about that. But I understand completely why it might have felt in the chaos of that morning like a warning that promised one thing and delivered something considerably worse. Why design a system this lethal at all? Doran asked, after a long moment of considering her explanation. For an installation as modest as the one contact point 7's debris field concealed. I have reviewed the technical assessments compiled after the war's conclusion. Doctor, Prometheus Station was a research facility, not a military installation in any conventional sense. I understand the strategic value of the research it conducted. I do not fully understand why that research warranted a defense system capable of destroying an entire scout cruiser. I have been asked that question many times since the war concluded, Commodore, by considerably more hostile interviewers than yourself, and I want to give you the same honest answer I have given every one of them, Bishara said. Prometheus Station's research concerned early fusion containment technology that would, within several years of the war's conclusion, become foundational to nearly every subsequent human deep space vessel's power architecture. We understood, at the time we designed the Sentinel Array, that the research itself represented a strategic asset considerably more valuable than the station's modest physical footprint might suggest to an outside observer conducting a purely visual assessment. We also understood, and I want to be honest, that this consideration weighed as heavily in our design process as the Ray. Search's own value, that a defense system calibrated to merely deter rather than genuinely destroy an attacking force, invites exactly the kind of escalating, repeated testing that eventually overwhelms any deterrent, however initially intimidating its reputation. We built the Sentinel Array to be completely, unambiguously lethal, and we built the beacon to describe that lethality with complete, unambiguous precision, because we had already concluded, in the design phase that preceded the war's opening months, that a defense system's genuine deterrent value depends entirely on potential attackers believing, correctly, that testing it will cost them everything they commit to the test. You built it to never actually need to be used, Doran said slowly, understanding arriving with a weight that settled somewhere between grief and a considerably more complicated form of professional respect. The precision, the 6 years of continuous broadcast, the complete absence of embellishment, all of it constructed specifically so that any commander conducting a careful, rational analysis would conclude exactly what Commander Thren concluded, and would never test it at all. That was always the intention, yes, Bishara said. I want you to understand, Commodore, that I have spent considerable time across the years since the war, thinking about the specific gap between that intention and what actually happened at contact point 7. We built a system designed to prevent exactly the tragedy it ultimately caused, And it failed to prevent that tragedy not because the warning was insufficiently precise, but because precision alone, delivered into a command culture that had spent 11 years learning to distrust precision as evidence of sophisticated deception, was never going to be enough on its own. I do not believe that failure was mine to carry alone, Commodore, and I do not believe it was General Brennothi's to carry alone either, whatever the formal record ultimately concluded about his individual culpability. I believe it belonged, in the end, to both our governments equally, to my own government's assumption that a sufficiently honest warning would always be believed simply because it was true, and to your own government's institutional habit of treating truth itself as a category that required independent verification before it could be trusted, even when that verification arrived too late to matter. Doran thought about that answer for a long time after their conversation concluded, understanding it, eventually, as the closest thing to a complete resolution he was ever likely to find for a grief that had, by then, shaped the entirety of his adult career. I have built my own career since Contact Point 7, around trying to close exactly that gap, Doctor, he said finally, teaching officers to credit precision as evidence of sincerity rather than evidence of sophistication. I do not know that I have fully succeeded. I know that I have tried, consistently, across every command I have held since, because I do not believe I am capable of doing otherwise, given everything that morning cost the people I served alongside. I believe you, Bishara said, and I want to tell you something, Commodore, that I do not say often, because I do not believe it is often deserved. I think Commander Thren would recognize the career you have built from her death, if she were somehow able to see it. I think she would recognize it as exactly the kind of institutional change her own final analysis was trying, in the last minutes of her life, to argue into existence, even if it arrived considerably later, and at considerably greater cost than either of us would have wished. Doran absorbed this for a long moment, understanding arriving with a complicated, layered weight he had not fully anticipated carrying into this conversation. Commander Thren argued that the beacon's specificity was evidence of its sincerity, he said finally. She was right in the end, more completely right than either of us understood in the moment. You told the exact truth, Doctor, in language precise enough that a careful enough analysis would have caught every detail of it, if we had only been given time enough to process what we'd already received. I have thought about that specific problem many times since the war concluded, Bishara said. The problem of a warning that is completely, technically true and still somehow insufficient to prevent tragedy, because truth delivered without adequate time to absorb it carries only part of the protection it was meant to offer. I do not believe the answer is to make our warnings less precise, Commodore. Precision is the entire point. It is what separates a genuine warning from an empty threat, and I have spent my career believing, and continuing to believe even now, that precision is a form of respect extended to whoever receives it, an acknowledgement that they deserve the exact truth rather than a comfortable approximation of it. But I have also come to believe, across the years since Contact Point 7, that precision alone is not enough. It has to be paired with enough redundancy, enough repetition across enough channels and enough time, that even an adversary operating under the worst possible conditions, under fire, under time pressure, under 11 years of institutional bias against believing what they're being told, has a genuine chance to actually absorb what they've been warned about before the consequence arrives. I have redesigned every subsequent system I've built in the years since that engagement around exactly that principle. Not less truth, more time to hear it. Doran thought about that conversation for the remainder of his life. In the considerable years of continued service that followed his formal retirement from active command. Years he spent, in no small part, helping design the Dominion's own post-war doctrine on exactly the kind of warning systems, both automated and diplomatic, that Contact Point 7 had first taught him at a cost he never fully stopped carrying to take with complete and literal seriousness. He established, within his own eventual command of the Dominion's reformed intelligence training academy, a mandatory course of instruction built entirely around the Contact Point 7 incident, requiring every cadet who passed through the academy's doors to study, in exhaustive detail, exactly how Commander Vesa Thren's careful, rigorous analysis had been dismissed, exactly why it had been dismissed, and exactly what it had cost the Ashen Vigil's crew to learn in blood. The lesson her analysis had already correctly anticipated. The course itself, which came to be known informally among successive generations of cadets simply as the Beacon, followed a structure Doran had refined over many years of personal instruction, beginning always with the raw sensor logs of the Beacon's original broadcast, played in full for each incoming class exactly as it had first reached the Ashen Vigil's bridge, before moving into a detailed reconstruction of Thren's analysis, Brennothi's counter-reasoning, and the specific institutional pressures that had led an experienced, generally cautious commander to dismiss evidence, his own subsequent report acknowledged, without qualification, had been correct. Doran insisted, across every iteration of the course he personally taught, that cadets engage directly with Brennothi's own writing on the subject, rather than simply hearing a second-hand summary of his eventual reform, believing, as he explained to more than one skeptical colleague who questioned the pedagogical value of centering a disgraced general's own words so prominently in the curriculum, that the specific, unflinching honesty of Brennothi's self-accounting carried an instructional weight that no third-person retelling could adequately replicate. "I do not teach this course to instill fear in any of you," he told each incoming class, in an address he delivered personally for as long as his own health allowed him to continue the tradition, standing before rows of young cadets who had not yet lived through anything remotely resembling the mourning that had shaped the entirety of his own subsequent career. "I teach it because I served alongside an officer named Vesa Thren, who understood, with a clarity our entire command structure failed to properly credit, that a warning constructed with genuine, unwavering specificity is not evidence of deception. It is evidence of a species that intends, completely and without exception, to be believed. I lost her, and 46 others, learning that lesson on a morning I have never once in all the years since stopped thinking about. I would ask each of you, whatever campaigns you eventually serve in, whatever warnings you eventually encounter, to carry her analysis with you as carefully as I have tried to carry it myself, so that the lesson she died proving correct never again has to be relearned, by any crew, at any cost remotely resembling the one my own crew paid to finally understand it." One cadet, some years into the course's formal instruction, asked him a question that Doran had not previously been asked in quite the same direct form, and that he found himself, in the moment, considering with a care he had not fully anticipated the question would require. "Commodore," the young cadet said, "you speak often about General Brennothi's transformation and about the reforms that followed his testimony. But I have read his own report closely, as you required, and I notice that he never once, in any of his subsequent writing, describes himself as having been forgiven, either by this Dominion or by his own conscience. Do you believe he ever forgave himself, Commodore, for what his decision cost?" Doran had been quiet for a long moment before answering, understanding that the question touched something he had, in all his years of careful, struck to. Read instruction, never quite allowed himself to examine directly in front of a class. "I do not believe he did," he said finally. "I served alongside General Brennothi for 2 years following the incident, and I corresponded with him occasionally in the years after our respective retirements, until his death some 11 years ago." He carried Commander Thren's memory with him, visibly, for the remainder of his life, in a manner that never once softened into the kind of comfortable distance most of us eventually find from even our most difficult regrets. I do not believe that failure to forgive himself was a weakness in him, Cadet. I have come to believe, across my own years of reflection, that it was the specific, difficult discipline that made his subsequent transformation genuine rather than merely performed. A general who forgave himself too easily, I think, might have drifted back over time, toward the comfortable certainties that had cost Commander Thren her life in the first place. He never permitted himself that comfort, and I believe this Dominion, and every crew he subsequently commanded, was considerably safer for his refusal to grant it to himself. He kept for the remainder of his career a small, unremarkable data crystal in his personal quarters, containing the full, unedited transcript of Commander Thren's final analysis, delivered in the minutes before the Ashen Vigil's shuttle crossed the marked perimeter that morning, and he would return to it privately on the anniversary of the engagement each year, reading through her careful, methodical reasoning one final time before allowing himself, in the quiet hours that followed, to remember the specific, unhurried competence of an officer whose warning had been every bit as precise and every bit as genuine as the one she had tried and ultimately failed to convince her own general to believe. He thought in those quiet annual hours of everyone the morning had touched, in ways that never fully resolved into a single, tidy lesson, no matter how many times he attempted to compress the whole of it into the careful, structured language of his own academy instruction. He thought of Commander Thren, whose rigorous, unhurried analysis had been correct in every particular, and had cost her, regardless, the 11 seconds she spent calling out withdrawal vectors from a station she never abandoned. He thought of Lieutenant Solandry, who had believed her too, and had said nothing through any channel his own institutional culture had left genuinely open to him. He thought of General Brennothi, who had carried the weight of that single decision for the remainder of his own long life, refusing himself the comfort of forgiveness even as his subsequent conduct earned, from nearly everyone who studied it afterward, exactly the kind of respect he never once permitted himself to accept. And he thought of Dr. Farah Bishara, half a galaxy away, who had built a warning system precise enough to prevent the very tragedy it ultimately caused, out of her own earlier grief for a different outpost, a different loss, a different lesson about the particular, costly difference between a warning meant to deter and a warning meant, completely and without exception, to be believed. He understood, finally, across all the decades of reflection those quiet anniversary hours afforded him, that the true legacy of Contact Point 7 was never simply the reforms it eventually produced, nor the doctrine it eventually rewrote, nor even the considerable number of subsequent engagements across the remainder of the war in which Dominion commanders, applying the lesson his own crew had paid so dearly to learn, withdrew from warnings they might once have dismissed, and in doing so, spared crews of their own the fate that had claimed Commander Thren and 46 of his own colleagues. It was something smaller and considerably harder to formalize into any training curriculum, however carefully constructed. It was the specific, permanent understanding, carried forward by everyone the morning had touched. That honesty offered in good faith deserved to be met with the same seriousness it was given, and that the cost of failing to extend that seriousness, however sincerely apologized for afterward, however thoroughly reformed against in the years that followed, could never be fully undone for the people who had already paid it. His crew never forgot the warning beacon, not because the Dominion's formal reforms required them to remember it, but because some lessons, once learned at sufficient cost, simply refuse, for the remainder of a person's life, to be set back down.